Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we're continuing to look at this concept that Paul is presenting. How as Christians sometimes we need to be willing to forego certain liberties that we have if it means that we're going to be able to better reach out to someone with the gospel or in order to prevent posing a temptation before that person. And Paul is using himself in chapter 9 as an example. More than likely, from what we see in the text, there were some in the church at Corinth who had been Christians for a longer period of time, who had a deeper amount of knowledge than others, who essentially were taking the position that, what's right's right, what's wrong's wrong, what's free is free, and what's bound is bound, and there can be no compromise in any area. Even if it's one of those areas of freedom. And that's what we're talking about here. Folks, we're not talking about matters of doctrine. We're not talking about matters where the Scriptures come out and blatantly tell us, no, a Christian cannot do that. We're talking about those areas where we are at liberty to choose for ourselves what's going to be the most appropriate way for us to handle those situations. Of course, he uses the example that they were facing there in the first century of eating meat that had been offered to idols. There were some Christians who had come out of those pagan religious groups who still, due to their lack of understanding, still placed a spiritual connection with those sacrifices that had been offered on those pagan altars. And so they viewed that, if we eat that food, that in some way we're offering our allegiance or our worship to that false god. Well, Paul spends quite a bit of time in the previous chapter, chapter 8, talking about while we know that's really not the case, while we know that there's really no substance to idols, there's nothing to the worship or the sacrifices that are being offered, if there are some who are continuing to struggle with this because they have not reached the level of spiritual maturity to understand, what their rights are in that regard, he said, those of us who do understand, we don't need to position ourselves in any way to where we're going to be putting them out, putting them on the spot, causing them to be in a precarious situation spiritually, causing them to go against where their conscience currently is. Now, we also address the fact that that is not saying that we cannot seek to teach them, to bring them to a better understanding, but essentially we are not to do anything that might cause a person to go against their conscience spiritually. Well, Paul, drawing from this knowledge that those in Corinth who had this knowledge, who were taking this stance, well, no, we're free. We have the freedom to do this, and we're going to do it no matter what, and we don't care who it offends. Paul tells them, no, that's not the attitude that you need to have. But folks, sadly, we see Christians today who still take that same mentality. Not just in spiritual matters, but we see them taking that type of attitude in secular matters and political matters and social matters, whatever the case may be. If we're free, if we have the liberty to make our own decision in this way, then our attitude is we can do whatever we want, however we want, and who cares if it offends anybody else? Well, as children of God, we understand that we are to always be striving for peace. We are to be striving, especially among brethren, to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. And so we should never willingly engage in some type of action that we know is going to be antagonistic toward another person. Now, that doesn't mean that there'll never be a time that we do something and someone else gets upset about it, no fault to us. There are people out there that are just very emotionally charged. and they get offended very easily. But what this is saying is that we are never to knowingly do something that we know is going to be antagonistic, that's going to be offensive, that is going to cause a brother to stumble. Well, Paul now steps in and puts himself into the picture. He says, those of you out there who are saying that you've been a Christian longer, you have a deeper knowledge, he says, let's think about it this way. He says, I've been in Corinth with you. You've seen the way that I've lived my life. You know that I'm an apostle. And you know that there are things that I certainly had the liberty to engage in. But I was willing to forego those things for a variety of different reasons. He talks about the fact that he certainly had the right to take a wife. We talked last week about the fact that the biblical record and any secular history that has been written never mentions that Paul or Barnabas, either one, ever married. And Paul tells us the reason for that was not because he didn't have the right to marry, but it was because he understood that with the scope of his ministry, that it was not best. And so he was willing to forego that liberty. He talks about this concept of eating and drinking. He talks about that it's an intrinsic human right to eat and drink. We get hungry, therefore we have the right to eat. We get thirsty, we have the right to drink. But with this, he's talking about this from the standpoint that it really doesn't matter what your degree of knowledge is. Paul was an apostle. He was inspired by the Holy Spirit. He had been led into all truth by the Holy Spirit. And Paul said, if I understand this concept, and I'm willing to forego certain liberties, he says, those of you who are not apostles, who are not inspired, who don't have that full knowledge, he said, you need to understand that this still applies to you. That you're never going to get to a point where you can say, well, because of where I have attained or what position I've attained in my spiritual growth, I don't have to worry about my actions before others. We have to be considerate to the way we are before others. And then he gives some other examples. He talks about things such as, who out there is going to make a decision to go to war if they have to pay the bill? And then he talks about, who plants a vineyard but does not enjoy some of the fruits of that vineyard. Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of that flock. What he's going to lead us into now is this concept that one of the things that he was willing to forego because he knew that there was an issue, especially in Corinth, dealing with this matter, was the concept of him being supported financially by the church for his labors as an apostle. He's talking about the fact, he says, whatever line of work that you're in, he says, you're not going to do that if you're not getting paid for it. He says, if you go out there, you put in that labor, is it not worth receiving some type of a reward? Receiving, as he's saying here, you receive the fruit of your labors, or you receive payment for the labor that you put forth. Well, that brings us up to where we're going to start today. Verse 8, do I say these things as a mere man? So starting out, he says, is this me just as a human being positing my opinions? He says, or does not the law say the same also? He says, no, it's not me. He says, this is what you've always understood. This is what the law of Moses taught. And then he gives some examples from the law of Moses. For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. So let's stop right there. So he uses this illustration of an ox that is treading out grain. There were a variety of different ways that grain could be harvested in those days. We read in the Old Testament some examples, especially in the book of Ruth, it talks about going down to the threshing floor. Well, one of the ways that grain would be harvested in very ancient times, they would go out and they would cut those stalks of grain, they would bind them together, and they would take it into this flat area, and there they would take those stalks of grain and would beat it on that hard floor to break the seed loose from the chaff or from the stalk of the grain. That was called the threshing floor. Well, then over time they developed a little bit more sophisticated ways of doing that, where it wasn't as much manual labor for a person, but they had developed a system to where an ox could be hooked up to a threshing machine. And as that ox would walk in a circle and would turn this machine, it would manually separate that. Well, what would happen is both some of the seed and some of the chaff would fall into the path where the ox was walking. Well, Paul asks the question. He says, are you going to put a muzzle on that ox so that ox doesn't eat any of that falls in its way? He says, no, that ox has that right. It says the law of Moses says that you're not going to muzzle the ox that is treading out the grain. The ox has the right to eat some of the fruits of its labor, but also that grain would be used to provide to provide food for that oxen over the next year. He says, so you look at this from the standpoint of an animal. He says nobody has an issue with this concept when it comes to an animal. An animal is worthy to be fed and provided for if they are carrying out the duties that they have placed upon them. He says the law of Moses tells us that's the way that it's supposed to be. But then he asks a question. He says, are we really talking about animals here? Is that really the message that this is trying to get across? And he says, no, animals are being used as an example. And while certainly animals do have that right to be fed and provided for, he says even more so, man. Even more so, man has that right. He says, it is written, he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partaker of that hope. Meaning you don't go out here and put forth that effort with the thought in your mind, I'm doing this for naught. You don't go out and plant a garden with the mentality, well, I'm eventually going to have to pull up all these plants because nothing's ever going to come forth. You go out there and you plant those tomatoes and that squash and those green beans and all of that with the mentality, I'm eventually going to benefit from the fruits of my labor. We get out each and every day and we go to work. And we do that with that mindset that after a week, 2 weeks, a month, whatever period of time, we're going to receive a paycheck for our labors. We do that with hope, with anticipation of what lies ahead. But if you look at verse 11, Paul says, if we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? And so starting out, this concept, the way this is being presented, is they really didn't have an issue with someone being paid if they were carrying out some type of physical menial task. If they were working in their chosen trade, they were putting forth an effort, working with the sweat of their brow, they really didn't have a problem with providing material things, providing money or food or what have you. But apparently the issue arose when they started trying to apply that to spiritual matters. Why would we provide a physical blessing, a material blessing, as a reward for spiritual work? Well, that's what Paul is addressing. He says, if someone has gone out, he's using himself as an example. If I've gone out and I've worked hard, sowing spiritually, I've gone out trying to save the souls of those in this community, why would I not be worthy to be supported by those that I am laboring with? But you see, this is an issue that has always plagued certain Christians. I mentioned last week that there is still a very small segment within the Lord's church today that believes that a preacher is not to be paid. And so they don't have what we would refer to as a located preacher. Their preachers all work secular jobs, they're bivocational, they're not supported by the church. Well, they need to go back and they need to look at what Paul is saying here. Because ultimately, what we need to understand is that if someone is putting forth an effort, putting forth labor, then they are worthy to be compensated. And whether that is compensating a preacher, compensating someone to clean the church building, someone to take care of finances, someone to keep up the building and grounds, someone to mow the grass, supporting missionaries to go out, whatever the case may be, if they are carrying out work, they have the right to be supported. But what Paul is going to show us is while they have the right to be supported, that doesn't mean they have to accept that support. If for some reason they feel like they don't need to accept it or it's going to cause a problem if they accept it, they don't have to accept that liberty. They don't have to accept that right. But that doesn't remove the fact that they have that right. Well, then Paul brings himself into the picture once again. He says, if others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Now there's a couple of different ideas as to what Paul is saying here. The first is that they were supporting certain individuals, that they more than likely they were seeing those who were actually there in the community working with the church day in and day out. Maybe they were supporting them, but they didn't see a need to support Paul and Barnabas because they weren't actually there in the community. They weren't putting forth, by their estimation, they weren't putting forth as much of an effort to benefit the church at Corinth. Folks, that would be like us having someone come in and hold a gospel meeting and not paying them because we say, well, you don't live in Pocahontas and you're not putting forth that much work here, therefore you're not worthy to be paid. Would that be right? No. Not at all. So what Paul is saying, he says if you're willing to support those that are local, those who the scope of their ministry is more limited, he says, would it not make sense that those of us who are going far and wide, who are not establishing a home, who are not having a family, who have devoted ourselves 100% to traveling around and preaching the gospel, are we not even more worthy to be supported than those who are keeping their ministry more limited? Well, of course, we understand because we support missionaries. We understand the importance of that. But continuing on, nevertheless, we have not used this right. He's talking about himself and Barnabas. He says, we've not forced this. We've not come in there and expected you to support us. Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things, lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. So he says, because there are some of you who disagree, because there are some of you who feel like Paul and Barnabas that we should not be paid. And he said, we've not come in there and tried to force this right upon you. We've not come in there and said, well, you have to pay us, you have to shelter us, you have to feed us, you have to provide for our needs. Well, folks, really, I think that's the mentality that anybody that's carrying out any type of ministry should have. Our mentality should never be to go somewhere and demand that someone provides us with something. I have an issue, and I'm kind of going to step on a soapbox for just a minute here, but So many times today, when congregations will contact me and want me to come and hold a meeting or come and speak, one of the first things they ask me is, how much do you charge? Folks, that bothers me. Well, my answer is always, I do not charge. But if the brethren want to support my efforts, whatever they want to do is more than acceptable. But sadly, I know there have been a couple of times, it's been several years back, I reached out to a couple of the more big-name preachers in the brotherhood and just communicated with them about a gospel meeting. One of them, the first thing that came out of his lips is, I will not come if I don't get paid at least $2,000. Plus, you have to pay my travel expenses, plus you have to provide me with a hotel, and you have to provide me with so much petty cash for meals. I said, I don't think that we'll be needing your services. Someone like that has lost sight of what's really important. Now, is that man worthy to be supported? If he's coming and he's putting forth effort, he's worthy to be supported. If someone travels a great distance, should the church provide travel expenses? I believe they should. If someone is coming here and they're a long way from home, should we provide them with somewhere to stay? Sure. Should we provide them either, us welcome them into our homes and provide them with a meal or give them some money to go in? Absolutely, they're worthy of that. But I have a problem, and I think that's what Paul is addressing here. I have a problem with someone saying, I'm not going to do it unless I get X amount. Folks, we've had preachers call the funeral home. New preachers come into this community. Now, I'm not talking about preachers in the Lord's church, but we've had denominational preachers come into this community, and they will call the funeral home and they'll say, put on your books, I will not do a funeral for less than $200, and it has to be paid through the funeral home. Why? Because some families, they do not feel like that is something that a preacher should be paid. They feel like that's just part of the work that he carries out. Once again, when someone asks me to preach a funeral, I never discuss payment. Because that's not what it's about. So Paul's saying, I've been there with you. You know, when I came into Corinth, I didn't tell you, while I'm here, you have to do this for me. He said, we understand that there are people there who have issues with this, who don't have the proper understanding of this. And so rather than cause problems for the church, we simply didn't bring it up. We didn't make it an issue. We did not exercise that right. Now we know from other scriptures that there were other congregations that didn't see this issue that were financially supporting Paul. And so he had the ability to be there in Corinth and labor. We also know that there were times he worked as a tent maker, his chosen trade, so that he would be able, to continue in his ministry. But he says, I didn't make it an issue. And I think that's what this whole point is coming down to. Folks, matters of liberty should never be made an issue. We should never make it such that it becomes an issue of division between brethren. We need to be willing to lovingly consider one another, to consider one another's conscience. And if we have to forego certain liberties for a time until that person grows in their spiritual maturity, then that's what we need to be willing to do. Any questions or comments? I've been talking a lot this morning and y'all haven't said much yet. Any questions or comments?
Some congregations that just out of their own love and liberality gave more than they even
Yeah.
Been surprised at how much was given. So it is a thing from the heart. It's not a thing that the preaching or any of the work shouldn't be done to earn that.
Right.
Yet it shouldn't be put on them as a burden either.
That's right. That's right.
Do you think, though, in our earlier, but in earlier days, that the congregation felt it more liberally to be supportive when we had a speaker come in or visitor come in? We always made sure that they had food and everything in home.
Yeah.
Maybe we didn't have much, but we always provided.
I think a lot of that comes down to the attitude of the congregation.
Well, yes.
Because as David was saying, there are a lot of congregations out there that are much more liberally minded in their giving, in their support, in their hospitality. You talk about in the older days. Some of you I know have probably read the book Arkansas Angels, talking about some of the old preachers from this area. And one I always think about, some of you probably remember the name Joe Blue. And there was one story about Joe Blue, said that he and Oscar Hayes, another preacher, actually the preacher that baptized my great-grandmother, had gone to, I think it was Cotter, Arkansas. They lived in the Hardy area, had rode a train to Cotter, had spent, I think it was a month in the community there, holding a month-long meeting. When the meeting ended, there was 8 inches of snow on the ground. And the last night of the meeting, each one of them received $1 and a handkerchief as their payment. They said it wasn't enough to get a train ticket back home, so they walked all the way home in the snow from Cotter to the Hardy area. And there's a lot of other stories. I can remember another instance, and this has been in more recent years. A meeting came to an end, and one of the elders got up and said, our tradition has always been when someone comes to hold a meeting, at the end of the meeting, we set a basket on the table, and we invite the members to come up and contribute toward payment. Well, the elder, after that had taken place, went and counted the money. And he came back, he said, well, they contributed $500. We decided that you're going to get $300 of it. So, coming back to what Sue was saying, should we be liberally minded in love and hospitality and giving? Yes, we should. But that's not always been the case everywhere. Because who is it ultimately that sets the tone of the congregation? The members. And if that's the way that we are in our everyday life, if we're loving and giving and hospitable, folks, that's going to carry over to the congregation. But if that's not the way that we are, then it's not going to be that way. And there are a lot of different scenarios. I've talked before about when Christy and I were in Alaska. The churches in Alaska are very different than they are here, because here, so many of us have our biological families close by. And so, there are many families that will still have Sunday lunch together, that still spend holidays together, and that kind of spills over into congregation life. We don't spend as much time with our brothers and sisters in Christ because we're spending so much time with our biological family. That's our Southern tradition. But you go into a place where you do not have biological family around, who becomes your family? Your church family. And so there was a much more of a closeness, I guess you would say, in those kinds of settings, because you came to have more than just a spiritual family aspect, because it evolved to include the spiritual, but also that physical, that biological aspect as well. And so, yes, I mean, there's ways. We have to consider it from, the cultural traditions of different places. We have to consider the demographic of every congregation. But coming back to what Paul is saying here, he says the labor that we do in the Lord, coming back to whether it's as a preacher, I mean, folks, I don't have a problem with and I know some disagree with this, I don't see a problem if you have an elder in the church who is a retired man, but he's putting forth a lot of labor working in the church. I don't see a problem with an elder being supported for his labors. Or as I said, cleaning the building, carrying out different ministries. I don't see a problem with people being supported for those things. But going back to what David says, when it comes to spiritual matters, we should not do that with that anticipation, I'm doing this to get paid. Because ultimately our reward's going to be in heaven, right? But we do have the right. That's what Paul's coming back to. We have the right to be supported. But that's something that we should be willing to forego if it's going to cause issues. Yes, sir.
I had customers that were preachers, and they want to know if they had a preacher discount.
A lot of places did give that.
Some places do that.
It's not a non-question, I don't think.
That is, we've a lot of places have done that and have spoiled those people, I think. And out there at the saw shop, we were just struggling along. And I'm not giving no discounts, but now my brother told me one time, he said, anytime you have a preacher or someone comes out there, he said, just do everything you can not to work on their stuff because he said, something will go wrong. And I said, no, that's not right. But he was right.
Well, and this is my opinion on this matter. I have never gone anywhere asking for a preacher discount. There have been places where I have gone that people knew I was a preacher, and so they gave a discount, but it's not something that I've ever asked for.
Right.
But I can tell you, in the years I've been at the funeral home, nearly every single preacher that we have ever buried, their family has asked for a discount.
Wow.
Well, don't you know how many funerals they've preached here through the years? Well, typically we do give a little bit of a discount. But it's coming back to what the whole thing that Paul's talking about here, folks. We don't do those things expecting that. We don't demand something. And that's what Paul is saying. We didn't come into Corinth demanding that you provide that. Yes, are we worthy to be supported? Yes, but we're not demanding that because we know that there are people who had issues that needed to be brought to a better understanding of those matters. So we did not make it an issue.
Sounds like it's kind of both sides. And what I mean is the minister / preacher and the congregation, they're both going to the extreme. Like I think that a lot of members of whatever church they attend, maybe they're not educated, maybe they don't know that you should pay because they're not in the business part of it, or wherever they go, hey, can you pay? It's something that you learn as you grow up.
Exactly. And that's what Paul's talking about, those who don't have that knowledge.
But then they get the attitude of, well, I'm not going to, he's doing that because he chose that profession to save souls. I'm not going to, God.
Well, sadly, Deb, there are a lot of...
the extreme, and I don't think that's right.
Sadly, there are a lot of Christians who never grow up.
Right.
I heard a lesson one time, and this title has always stuck with me. There's a lot of Peter Pan Christians. You know the old story of Peter Pan, the little boy that never grew up. There's a lot of people out there who have worn the name Christian for many, many years, but have never grown up from that basic elementary faith. Yes, sir.
I won't just leave it like that. I had some preachers that would give you an extra
Yeah.
They were, few and far between those that always wanted to overpay. But they were in the ministry.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Wanted to make a point too. I don't think anybody should feel guilty if they do accept something either. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about here. And this came up all the way back when one of those hurricanes came through. It was kind of a joke, but it makes a point. Somebody was up on their rooftop when all that flood came at them and said, God save me, God save me. And somebody came with a boat, no, God's going to save me. Some kind of helicopter, no, God's going to save me. They end up dying. And the point I'm trying to make is, maybe you were financially struggling, but you were doing this for the right reasons, and somebody was trying to compensate you, and I can't do that, I can't do that. But you're praying to God to help you be blessed to be able to take care of your bills and all. Then who's it wrong?
It's right. Exactly.
Because, we don't always think the way God thinks, or do the things the way God would do them.
That's
But
right.
we can't pray for blessings, and the blessings are theirs, and you don't take advantage of them.
That's right. That's right. And that's kind of where Paul is going to carry this thought moving forward in this chapter. He's going to talk about the fact that, God has always provided. He's going to talk about, the workers in the temple, part of their food came from the sacrifices. Part of that had to be given to provide for them. And so,
How that way is going to be.
exactly.
And we shouldn't pass judgment on that.
That's right.
We don't know.
That's right. Well, we're going to stop for right there. And then, Lord willing, next Sunday morning, we'll pick up in verse 13.